The People's Platform.
Good evening and welcome to Friday's edition of the People's Platform. I'd like to start off this interview by reading from the preamble to the Constitution. We, the freely elected representatives of the people of Sri Lanka, humbly acknowledging our obligations to our people to constitute Sri Lanka into a democratic socialist republic whilst ratifying the immutable republican principles of representative democracy and assuring to all peoples freedom, equality, justice, fundamental human rights and the independence of the judiciary as the intangible heritage that guarantees the dignity and well-being of succeeding generations of the people of Sri Lanka and of all the people of the world who come to share with those generations the effort of working for the creation and preservation of a just and free society. Do hereby adopt and enact this Constitution. Good evening and welcome to the show. I am so pleased to welcome to the studio my guest tonight, Professor Savitri Goonesekere, Emeritus Professor of Law, University of Colombo. Good evening, Professor. Good evening. Lovely to have you with us.
Nice to be with you, Silali.
Professor, independent institutions are a cornerstone of democracy, of the rule of law, separation of powers. Just this morning, it was announced that a select committee will be appointed to inquire into the Constitutional Council due to delays in approving appointments. What are the implications of this decision?
Sonali, I think we are at a very, at a point in our history which should concern citizens, because we are seeing in this man-made economic crisis a huge push for a different kind of governance from the democracy that is promised in that preamble and in the Constitution. Democratic governance is participatory governance. It has no place for individual person's vision to be realized in any manner that they want. So when in a democracy you have different institutions, you have parliament, you have the executive and you have the courts. These are supposed to function with respect and balance with regard to each other's powers, and no one authority can take over completely. This is what the dissolution of parliament case said. After 72 we don't have a monarch in this country. We have a accountable executive which must conform to the constitution, to the parliament's powers, and also respect for the judiciary. Now, in a constitution which is premised on democracy, you don't have to have only the parliamentary, you have to create other institutions to support concept that there should be a balance so that you can't abuse power. Right. That's the whole idea of democracy, that you should not abuse state power. So therefore, we created independent commissions. We created a Constitutional Council. Independent commissions are the Human Rights Commission, the Election Commission, which will ensure respect for the rights and freedoms of the people and a balanced exercise of state power. That's the purpose of those. So the purpose of the Constitutional Council is less, it's narrower, but it has a role of ensuring accountable appointments to high office. So it's not part of the executive. It is a separate institution to ensure that the norms of good governance in terms of the rights of the people are actually implemented in governance. That is its role. So if that is its role, then it has an oversight function over appointments. So one would expect committee between the executive and the Constitutional Council, so that the executive and the president would send people's names for appointment to high office that would meet the guidelines and the bars set by the Constitutional Council. So it's a separate independent body. And you completely undermine the whole relevance of the Constitutional Council if you say that Parliament now must have a select committee to see whether they are doing their job or not. What does it mean? It means that the executive is now impatient. The executive today, and I would say that means a president, because we know that quite often when the cabinet comes and people come and say, "Me ape me garu janadipatitumarge tiranaවට අපේ සම්පූර්ණ එකකතාව ප්‍රකාශ කරනවා." It means basically they are rubber stamp. So therefore it's an individual executive power. So when the individual executive power says no, we don't want scrutiny. I, executive, am the appointing authority. Nobody has any business to question that. When the whole purpose of the Constitutional Council is to ensure that high posts conform to constitutional norms and standards. So, when there is this kind of hiatus, basically you are dismantling democratic institutions, and that is a sadness for us. We do not want that. If we have democracy in this country, we expect the different arms of government to respect the balance of power between these organs. That is the whole point.
So, what's the way forward in this scenario?
Yes, I would say that this is a very serious issue, and this is the point. When you have a strong majority and an opposition which is in that sense weak, then whatever the opposition says in this regard and questions really doesn't make a difference. But I don't know enough of the select committee process, but I am sure there must be a process by which the opposition can query the very concept of appointing a parliamentary select committee as completely unconstitutional, because the president can't get into conflict with the Constitutional Council. The president is expected to respect the decision of the Constitutional Council, because there are several members, there are 3 outside members, and therefore, if they can't come, if they say, for example, we are not willing to accept this particular appointment, then sorry, he must come up with a different name.
Time and time again, we see the manner in which the people's representatives don't work for the best interests of the people who appoint them. We see hooliganism in action in Parliament, even as recently as 2 days ago. The physical intimidation, the sheer disrespect. How does this feature with the foundational principles of parliamentary democracy, Professor?
Short answer, it doesn't. It is amazing that the elected representatives who are elected by the voters of this country come into office and then completely forget the people whose votes they have apparently humbly acknowledged. This is because in this country we have had post-independence constitutions after 72, which really have not conformed to some of the core norms of democratic governance. I say this because the 72 constitution, for instance, gave an unbalanced significance to the legislature, the National State Assembly, and they said the people are the political. They introduced the first time the concept of the sovereignty of parliament, which is core to democracy and to the concept of the social contract between the people and the ruler, was introduced in 72. But they called the people the political sovereign and called the NSA they called them the legal sovereign.
Right.
So consequently, they had an aggrandizement and enormous power. And we saw, and it's all recorded in history, how that destabilized institutions. That was followed by the 78 constitution, which turned the tables in a way and created a very powerful executive. So what has happened is, when people get into parliament, they only think of themselves as empowered representatives. They have no sense of responsibility to the people who elected them. They do not understand that they have come in to hold responsible office as members of parliament. All they know is, we have come into power. So it's a question of power as opposed to responsibility. So consequently, they think nothing of engaging in adversarial conflict in parliament instead of responsible debate and discussion. That's the role of a parliament. So instead of that, they descend to this, and then I am told, we don't know, we are not privy to it, how many of them have the qualifications to engage in debate and discussion. But even the people who do, quite often, don't do that in government, as we saw in the debate on the no confidence motion. It's a no confidence motion based on responsible information with regard to corruption in the Ministry of Health, the health sector, where we had won brownie points in the whole of South Asia for our performance. And then that debate descended into mudslinging. And at one point, the minister concerned turned and said, "Munta gahanna one." So that's what we have created this through this process of a loss of any kind of sense of responsibility in office being replaced by the concept of power. So this is the root cause of it, and the cause of it also in this case is the many years of the executive presidency, because the executive presidency in its current avatar is the concept that gives a sense of all powers in one person. So other people who have powers, be they ministers, be they members of parliament, are all exercising power rather than responsibility. So the foundation of democracy then goes, and that's what we see.
What we're seeing in Parliament today, and in the larger scheme of things really, is quite dystopian almost. I'd like to connect this with the importance of public consultation in policy making, because today we see how laws are used to weaponize against the people, as opposed to being in the best interests of the people, and public consultation doesn't meaningfully take place in most instances. Speak to us about the importance of this relationship between the state and the people.
The concept of democracy in this sense is because of this social contract between the ruler and the ruled. Then therefore the whole point of democratic governance is to ensure that the ruler does not abuse power. So the containment of the authority of the state and preventing abuse of power is at the root and the foundation of democracy. That's what it really means. So if that is so, then there has to be respect for the fundamental rights of the people. There is separation of powers between the three organs of government, that is parliament, executive and the courts, but there has to be respect for each other's performance, and there has to be this kind of cooperation and responsibility to each other. So what happens in this case is, if there is lawmaking and policy making, then naturally it has to be a consultative process, because if it is going to be people oriented, their task is to the parliament, the executive and the judiciary are supposed to have this central focus on realizing the well-being of the people. Now you can't do that if you do policy planning and legal regulation without any consultation. And very often we have in this country laws, nobody knows who drafted it.
Yeah.
And as one of the great justices in England said, conceived in secrecy, brought forth in obscurity. So for example, the anti-terrorism law, look at the definition of terrorism, so vague. Look at the online law, so vague. Who drafted? We don't know. So this kind of drafting, legislative drafting, is totally contrary to the democratic process. But there have been good examples. There was a time we have served, many of us have served, in consultative roles with government on legislation.
Right.
If you think of the domestic violence legislation, look at the engagement of women's groups. Look at the right to information law, which would have concerned all of media. It was a hugely consultative process.
Yeah.
And that law is now being referred to, even in that IMF, I think, diagnostic assessment report, as a good law. So recently what we have had is bad laws. We don't know who drafted them, and we don't know what emerges. So the whole concept of policy formulation, legal draftsmanship, and indeed even policy implementation should be a participatory process with the engagement of stakeholders, who are the people. In fact, in the case of the Eppavala case, I remember when the policy was faltered, the famous Eppavala case on the exploitation of the phosphates, in the judgment itself, the court received reports from a battery of experts led by the late V.K. Samaranayake on what the implications were.
Right.
And they used that to say, well, why didn't you do this? And so the court struck down the policy decision. So consultation, Sonali, is absolutely critical to both law making and policy formulation. So when we don't have that, then what happens? lawmaking becomes a process to aggrandize power to the executive. That is very typical of authoritarian governance, not democracy.
Professor, I'd like to draw your attention to the recent Supreme Court judgment with respect to accountability for the current economic crisis that led to bankruptcy, where accountability for misuse of power in decision making was directly attributed to identified individuals, including and not limited to the former president and former prime minister. Speak to us about the implications of this judgment. Help us understand better what we can do in view of this judgment.
Yes, Sonali, I think this judgment at this particular juncture is extremely important, not just from a jurisprudential point of view in a legal sense, but from the point of view of the people, because the action actually was brought by some particular individuals, and then also it was what you call a public interest petition, on the basis that it also was arguing that there was a violation of the rights of all the people of the country. So in our country we have this concept of locus standi to bring an action, and that was conformed with because of the concept of individuals going to court and this way. So the point of this case was to say the rights of the people had been completely disregarded, not in the policies or the legislation, because legislation in our country can't be challenged once it is passed. So the Inland Revenue Act had already been passed. So the question was, the challenge was to the decisions in public administration by the president, the executive arm, the president, the prime minister, and these people that actually contributed to the economic collapse. And they focused on the manner in which those decisions were made, the manner in which it was done, which did not conform to norms of good governance in executive policy making, which should be consultative, which would be based on information provided, etc. And they specifically use the words like unreasonable, irresponsible, not conforming to any analytical principles which should have been adopted, and irresponsibility in decision making. So we must not mistake it as an inroad of the courts on actual policies, which was the argument of in the dissenting. The dissenting judgment was based on the fact that this is a political question. This is legislation, because Parliament had already passed in tax law. It is also a political question which the courts should avoid. But the Supreme Court importantly said, you can't use the cover of this issue of the separation of powers to clothe in legitimacy administrative decision making and executive decision making, which violates completely responsible decision making and policy. So arguments like this was in the mandate of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. This vision of prosperity was in his manifesto, and this new homegrown solution to economic solution was part of a promise made to the nation. They rejected that attitude, and they said, you can't do that, and then you can't then engage in all that and then end up in a situation where the country goes to bankruptcy, where you have failed to take into account even the actual advice given to you by the senior officials of the central bank. So you go off in your decision making on other imperatives, you are accountable. And that is the concept of public trust. If you hold office, you should exercise those responsibilities in fulfillment of the responsibilities of office, which is to protect the rights of the people. That was one. The second premise was the understanding of equality. Equality in law sometimes is a narrow concept. In this judgment, they absorb the jurisprudence that the fundamental right is to equality and to equal protection of the law. Right. So consequently, they said that you don't have to have a comparator even. The fact of the matter is, if the executive arm and the decision making completely disregards the rights of the people and the impact on the people, like for example this economic collapse, then the right to equality is also part of the rule of law and the violation of the rights of the people. So, equality and equal protection of the law links to the very existence of the rule of law in the country, and they must conform to that, and failure to do that then is an issue of they have failed in fulfilling the public trust. So, in that context, I was amazed at the manner in which this very important concept, which is the foundation of the Supreme Court decision, was tossed around in Parliament by the government, including, I mean, the way they reacted to the leader of the opposition's comment on the case by taking the file for him, throwing the file, grabbing the file from him, the chaos in Parliament, and the President himself making a facetious comment on public trust. When public trust is, the public trust is the responsibility of a person who holds office, not a person who comes into office, or who, oh no, sorry, I'm not a person who refuses to take office. Public trust is the concept of your responsibilities in holding office. So, to trivialize it and use it as a general phrase that covers anything, it was sad to see that in Parliament. So, the judgment, I think, at this point is extremely important, because these imperatives on what is equality and equal protection of the law, how does it connect with rule of law and good governance, and how then does it connect to the concept of the responsibilities of office and the public trust, three important concepts which, if they are respected and become the foundation of governance, can then maybe give us a governance which we are not having.
We have the judgment in black and white. Where do we go from here?
Well, that's a good question, because as far as the value of the judgment is concerned, I think it's not just jurisprudential, because these foundational ideas that the sovereignty of the people, Janata Paramaditve, is not some abstract concept, right? It is something real. That's what the Supreme Court is saying. It means if you respect the sovereignty of the people, it does not mean that sovereignty is kingship, like what some monks say, no, the president is a king. Sovereignty doesn't mean that one person can do everything he's done. Sovereignty does not mean electoral politics. So, you think of the sovereign people only when you ask for the vote. It's not that. Sovereignty of the people has to be founded in a constitution and making a living reality, which is respect for the people. So, if that is so, this is very important in the judgment to fertilize, I think, even if Parliament does nothing on it, because this is not a issue of a criminal case. The accountability is violation of the fundamental rights of the people, which is very serious. However, it goes to the importance of questioning the mandate to govern. If, for example, in the Supreme Court has said these three things have not been done, therefore these people are responsible, then do they have the mandate to continue in office? And if the IMF is negotiating, does the IMF, can it negotiate with people who have brought the country to bankruptcy? And the next question is, can a person who is an unelected president, who then is now with a government which is being held responsible for bankruptcy, give leadership? So, to me, the Supreme Court is a powerful platform to raise these questions.
My final question, because we're on to our last 5 minutes, the online safety bill determination by the Supreme Court, if you can also help us understand better the nuances of how court determined constitutionality, Professor.
Thank you. That's a good question, Sonali, because when I read this Supreme Court decision, my mind went back to the great justices that we have had. Justice A.R.B. Amara Singha, the late Justice Mark Fernando, Justice Prasanna Jayapardhan, and judges today, like for example, Justice Kodagada has written a wonderful judgment on freedom of speech. Justice Janak de Silva on several judgments, including the powers of the AG. Justice Mark Fernando and on this very concept of the public trust. So, this has come in early jurisprudence. Public trust has been there in early interpretation of equality. Was Mark Fernando, Justice Mark's contribution. He took equality as a formal concept and broadened it out to link it to arbitrary abuse of power. So, we have had great jurisprudence, and the best jurisprudence follows that chartered course, which is what the Supreme Court has done. But I have to say, our country jurisprudence is patchy. Lawyers often argue for this analysis of rights being located in this way in democracy, etc. But sometimes they fail, and I think in the online safety bill there were many people who said foundational values of the constitution on freedom of speech, etc. had been completely destroyed, and therefore the whole bill was bad. But then what happens is sometimes courts don't they don't take that attitude. When they don't take that attitude, they don't look at it holistically as we expect them to, and then they take clause by clause. Is it constitutional? Is it not? And that is encouraged also with a procedure which is really contrary to the Constitution's concept of fundamental rights, which is the Attorney General coming to court and saying this amendment is going to be introduced, this change is going to be made, etc. And when the 20th Amendment came to court, lawyers objected to that and said, you can't do this because you have to view it holistically, you see. But that practice now has become part of the Attorney General's department practice too. So, this is not basically the kind of jurisprudence, with all respect, we can say conforms with the real idea of constitutionalism, which is the constitution is there, fundamental interests there, the sovereignty of the people is there in order to ensure that the state does not abuse power and acts for the well-being of the people.
What's the way forward?
That is very difficult. I've just made, before this came into this for this interview, I met a young person who told me that all the young people are leaving the country. They are not traitors to the cause. They are not traitors to the country. They are people who are desperate because they do not see the promise of the Constitution, the promise of democracy realized. So, one way is that I think the way forward is to dismantle the whole system of the executive presidency, which to me is something that is the foundational reason for this toxic concept of abusive power at every level of governance. And it will continue unless you dismantle it and you go back to a parliamentary system of governance. That is one way forward. The other is that in this situation where a Supreme Court of the country has given this judgment, and they have done it, you can't talk of the lack of capacity of the court to do this, because they have gone to all the specific area with enough information. So, it is not a judgment which is superficial, it is in depth, pages and pages of pages, where every part, the tax bill, the interest rates, the floating currency, floating exchange rate, all that is addressed. So, if in that situation, then I think the people of the country have the right to say, you cannot govern, we want elections, both presidential and parliamentary, soon as possible. And I would conclude with this last, you quoted Sonali, the preamble at the beginning, I am quoting the last phrase. What does it say? May the rains fall in season, may there be a good harvest, may there be well-being in the world, may the ruler be righteous. And the message of this Supreme Court decision is, you cannot have economic growth without good governance. And they made that link.
This is such a beautiful discourse. Thank you so much, Professor Savitri Goonesekere.
It's been a pleasure, Sonali. Thank you for inviting me. I enjoy your program, so it's good to be interviewed by you.
Thank you for watching us. Have a safe weekend. Good night.